Mr. Sung-woo. I was only ever a substitute for GR. So why does the way you look at me feel like I'm the only woman you've ever actually seen? Welcome to the channel. You're about to experience a story that will stay with you long after it ends. Before we begin, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who might need this story today. Your support helps us bring more meaningful stories to life. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from, and now, let's dive straight into the story. Let me be clear about what this is, Ms. Abigail. You bear a resemblance to someone I once loved. That is the beginning and the end of your value here. You will be compensated well. You will ask nothing further. And you will not make the mistake of believing that what happens inside these walls means anything beyond our agreement. He straightened his cufflinks without looking at her. You are a substitute. A temporary one. Conduct yourself accordingly. The palace did not welcome her. It simply allowed her inside. Abigail noticed that distinction the moment the iron gates parted and the black car rolled up the gravel drive, the way the estate received her the way a museum receives a visitor. Tolerant. Indifferent. Already certain of its own superiority. She kept her face neutral and her hands loose in her lap. She had learned a long time ago that the most dangerous thing a woman could do in a room full of power was let it see her flinch. Inside, the ceiling soared. Marble floors caught the afternoon light filtering through arched windows and threw it back in pale gold. Chandeliers hung like frozen explosions of crystal. Butlers moved along the periphery in black tuxedos, their expressions professionally empty, their eyes trained to look at nothing directly. Abigail catalogued all of it in a single sweep: exits, staff positions, the weight of money in every surface, and then she folded her hands in her lap and waited. He made her wait 20 minutes. When Sung-woo finally entered, he did not apologize for it. He crossed the room with the unhurried certainty of a man who had never once needed to rush toward anything, because everything had always eventually come to him. He was younger than she expected and more dangerous looking than the photographs had suggested. Dark suit, open at the collar. The ghost of tattoo ink visible at his throat. A face carved out of something harder than handsome. He sat across from her and looked at her the way a man looks at a document before he signs it. Assessing value, calculating risk, feeling nothing in particular. Ms. Abigail. His English was precise, unhurried. I'll say this once. She met his gaze and said nothing. Another thing she had learned: silence costs you nothing and reveals even less. You bear a resemblance to someone I once loved. He picked up the contract from the table beside him without looking at it. That is the beginning and the end of your value here. You will appear at the functions I require. You will conduct yourself with the appropriate bearing. You will be compensated well. He set the document in front of her. You will ask nothing further. And you will not make the mistake of believing that what happens inside these walls means anything beyond our agreement. He straightened his cufflinks without looking at her. You are a substitute. A temporary one. Conduct yourself accordingly. The word landed the way he intended it to, flat, precise, designed to reduce. Abigail let it sit in the air between them for exactly 2 seconds. Then she reached forward, picked up the contract, and began to read. She took her time. She read the compensation clause twice. She noted the exit conditions, the duration, the penalty structure for early termination on either side. She turned to page 4, where the confidentiality terms lived, and read those 3 times. Sung-woo watched her with an expression that had not shifted 1 degree since he entered the room. When she finished, she set it down and looked at him. The monthly retainer is acceptable, she said. The termination clause is not. If you end this arrangement early for any reason outside of documented breach on my part, I want 60% of the remaining balance paid within 72 hours. She held his gaze. Non-negotiable. Something moved behind his eyes. Not warmth. Not anger. Something quieter and more difficult to name, the faint recalibration of a man who had expected less from her. He was quiet for a moment. Then he picked up a pen and made the amendment himself, right there on the page, in clean decisive strokes, and slid the contract back across the table. Abigail signed it without celebrating. She was not here because she trusted him. She was not here because she felt anything about this palace or this man or the ghost of a woman she supposedly resembled. She was here because her family's debt had a number attached to it, and she had just taken the first step toward making that number disappear. Everything else was noise. She heard the name before she understood what it meant. Gia. It moved through the palace the way a current moves through water, invisible on the surface, felt in everything beneath it. A butler dropped a tray in the east corridor and did not stop to clean it up. Two of Sung Woo's lieutenants stood outside the war room with their voices low and their shoulders drawn in, the particular posture of men delivering news they did not want to deliver. A maid passed Abigail in the hallway without making eye contact, which was unusual, because the staff had been trained to at least perform acknowledgement. Abigail noticed all of it and said nothing. She had been inside the palace for 3 weeks. Long enough to learn its rhythms, the way it breathed differently depending on Sung Woo's mood. Long enough to know that this, whatever this was, had shifted something fundamental in the air pressure of the entire estate. She found out through Minji, one of the younger maids who had made the mistake of finding Abigail approachable. The girl appeared in the doorway of Abigail's suite that evening with fresh towels that did not need replacing and eyes too bright with the effort of containing something large. They found her, Minji said, and then seemed to realize she had said it aloud, and pressed her lips together. Abigail kept her expression still. Found who? The girl's eyes dropped to the floor. Gia sigh. A pause, barely a breath. Mr. Sung Woo's, she was thought to be dead. For 2 years. She set the towels down with exaggerated care. She is not dead. After Minji left, Abigail stood at the window for a long time and looked out at the manicured grounds going dark under the evening sky. She was not hurt. She was not jealous. She was neither of those things because she had not allowed herself to become either of those things. What she felt was something more practical and considerably more urgent. She felt the contract becoming unstable beneath her feet. She had built her entire calculation on a simple foundation. Sung Woo needed a stand-in for a ghost. Ghosts, by definition, did not come back. The entire architecture of her arrangement, the money, the timeline, the clean exit she had been quietly engineering, had been constructed on top of that assumption. The assumption was no longer valid. She watched Sung Woo from a careful distance over the next 4 days and catalogued what she saw. He cancelled 2 scheduled appearances without explanation. He stopped coming to dinner. His lieutenants cycled in and out of the war room at hours that suggested no one inside was sleeping. Once, crossing the upper landing, she caught a glimpse of him standing alone at the far end of the portrait gallery, utterly still, staring at something she could not see from where she stood. He looked like a man being pulled backward through time against his will. Abigail returned to her suite and began, very quietly, to pack. Not everything. Not in any way that would be visible to the staff or read as panic. She simply began moving her most essential items, documents, the emergency cash she kept folded inside a particular coat lining, her spare phone, into the bag she kept under the bed. A little each day. The way you prepare for a storm you cannot stop but can at least see coming. She had taken this job with one rule intact above all others: never be the last to know when the ground is shifting. She had felt it shift. She was not going to stand on it and wait to see how far it fell. The money she had been paid so far was enough to cover a significant portion of the debt. Not all of it, but enough to negotiate, to buy time, to find another way. She had operated on less before. On the 4th night she sat on the edge of her bed with the packed bag beside her and ran the numbers one more time in her head, calm and methodical, the way she did everything. She gave it 1 more week. If the ground shifted any further, she was gone before it swallowed her whole. Wait, before I continue, hit subscribe and tell me where you're watching from, because this next part is insane. The meeting was scheduled for 10 in the morning, which told her everything. Important things at the palace happened in the evening, over dinner, with the weight of a full day's power behind them. Morning meetings were for dismissals. For matters the principal did not want to dignify with his personal presence. Abigail dressed carefully anyway, black, structured, heels that added 2 inches she did not need but chose deliberately, and walked into the small receiving room off the east wing with her face arranged into something pleasant and unreadable. Kang Hyun-soo was already seated. Sung Woo's underboss was a broad, quiet man with the kind of stillness that was not peace but patience, the particular patience of someone who had learned that most problems resolve themselves if you simply outlast them. He had a folder on the table in front of him and a manner that suggested he found this errand mildly beneath him. Ms. Abigail. He gestured to the chair across from him. Please. She Saturday. She did not lean back. He opened the folder and slid a single sheet of paper across the table. A number sat in the center of it, clean and deliberate. She looked at it without touching it. It was 40% of what she was owed. Given the change in Mr. Sung Woo's personal circumstances, Hyunsu said, his voice carrying the smooth finish of a man accustomed to delivering bad news as though it were reasonable, we feel this figure represents a fair and generous. No. He paused. A small pause, barely a beat, but she caught it. I'm sorry. No, Abigail said again, in exactly the same tone. She pushed the paper back across the table with 2 fingers, the way you return something that was never yours to begin with. That figure doesn't represent fair and generous. It represents an assumption about what I'm willing to accept under pressure. She folded her hands on the table. The assumption is incorrect. Hyunsu looked at her for a moment. Then something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile, but the precursor to one, the twitch of a man recalibrating. The contract has a force majeure provision. A change in personal circumstances. Does not constitute force majeure, she said. I read that contract 4 times before I signed it. The clause covers acts of God and governmental interference. GR being alive is neither. She kept her voice level, almost conversational. I fulfilled every obligation for the duration I was engaged. I appeared where I was required. I conducted myself with the bearing specified. I held up my end of the arrangement without variation. Ms. Abigail. I'll take double. The room went quiet. Hyunsu stared at her. I don't think you understand the position you're in. I understand it completely, she said. You want a clean exit with no complications. I am offering you exactly that. Double the original contract value, transferred within 48 hours, and I walk out of here today with nothing that could ever become a complication for Mr. Sung Woo or this organization. She let that settle. Try to move me out of here for 40% and I become a loose end. I don't imagine Mr. Sung Woo enjoys loose ends. She watched him process it. The subtle tightening around his eyes that told her he was no longer certain this was the routine errand he had arrived expecting. Wait here, he said. He was gone for 11 minutes. She counted. When he returned, he did not sit. He simply placed a new sheet of paper on the table, a transfer confirmation, the full double amount, pending authorization, and looked at her with something that was not quite respect but was adjacent to it. 48 hours, he said. Thank you. She picked up the document, folded it once, and tucked it into her jacket. Then she stood, smoothed her lapel, and walked to the door. She did not see Sung Woo standing in the adjoining corridor as she passed, still as the marble around him, watching her go. She did not see the expression on his face. But Hyunsu did. Stop scrolling. Subscribe right now, and tell me where you're watching from, because the twist that's coming? You won't believe it. She was packed and ready by 7. The transfer had cleared at 4 a.m. She had lain awake watching for it, phone face up on the pillow beside her like a lifeline, and the moment the confirmation landed she had felt something unknot in her chest that had been pulled tight for weeks. She showered, dressed, and had her single bag by the door before the palace staff had finished laying out breakfast. Her car was scheduled for 9. She sat on the edge of the bed and gave herself exactly 2 minutes to feel the quiet satisfaction of a woman who had walked into a lion's den and walked back out with what she came for. Then the first explosion went off. It came from the south gate, a concussive thud that moved through the marble floors and up through the soles of her feet before her brain had fully processed the sound. Then shouting, sharp and directional, in Korean, followed by the specific staccato crack of gunfire that no amount of television prepares you for because the real thing is faster and closer and completely indifferent to your presence. Abigail was already moving. She did not run for the exit. The exit was south, where the noise was. She went up, instinct overriding logic, taking the servants' staircase 2 steps at a time until she reached the interior corridor on the 2nd floor. Windowless, marble, structurally sound, and pressed her back against the wall to think. She had perhaps 4 seconds of thinking before Sung Woo came around the corner. He was in shirt sleeves, a gun in his right hand, blood at his temple from something she could not immediately identify, his eyes moving fast and cold across every angle of the corridor before they landed on her. She expected him to issue a command. To dispatch her somewhere, or ignore her entirely, the way powerful men ignored variables they hadn't accounted for. Instead he crossed to her in 3 strides, took hold of her arm, and pulled her through a door she had not noticed, a narrow service passage that ran parallel to the main hall, dark except for the emergency lighting that had kicked on somewhere below, casting everything in a dim arterial red. "Don't speak," he said. "I wasn't going to," she said. He looked at her sideways. She looked straight ahead. They moved through the passage for what felt like a long time but was probably 4 minutes, the sounds of the attack muffled and disorienting through the walls, until Sung-woo stopped at a reinforced door, keyed a code into the panel beside it, and pushed it open into a small internal safe room, windowless, steel-lined, a single light strip overhead. He pulled the door shut behind them. The sounds of the assault became almost abstract. A distant percussion. Someone else's emergency. Abigail set her back against the far wall and breathed. Sung-woo stood at the door, one hand still on the handle, his gun lowered. For a long moment neither of them said anything. Then she noticed the cut at his temple was bleeding more than she had initially assessed, and she crossed to him without deliberating about it, pulled the folded handkerchief from her jacket pocket, the same jacket that held the transfer confirmation, and pressed it against the wound with steady, impersonal hands. He went very still. Not from pain. She understood the difference. "You don't rattle," he said. His voice was different in the small space. Lower. Stripped of its formal cadence. "Rattling is expensive," she said. "I can't afford it." He was looking at her in a way he had not looked at her before. Not the assessing look from the contract table, and not the absent look she had catalogued over 3 weeks of careful distance. This was something with weight to it. Something that had no transaction underneath it. "Gia would have been screaming," he said. It did not sound like a compliment to Gia. Abigail kept her hand steady against his temple and said nothing. She was not interested in being compared. She was not interested in the ghost whose face had apparently bought her a contract and whose resurrection had nearly cost her one. But in the red-lit silence, she felt him looking at her like she was real. Like she was, inconveniently and undeniably, the most real thing in the room. She had not left. The attack had damaged the south gate and 2 of the outer guard posts, and Sung-woo's security team had locked down all departures until the estate perimeter was cleared and assessed. Abigail had been informed of this by Hyunsoo in a tone that suggested it was a logistical inconvenience rather than a decision, which she understood was his way of telling her it was not negotiable. She had nodded, returned to her suite, and sat with her packed bag by the door like a woman waiting for a train that kept getting delayed. She was still waiting when Gia arrived. She heard it before she saw it, a soft, escalating disturbance in the entrance hall below, voices shifting register the way they do when something emotionally significant is being performed for an audience. Abigail moved to the upper landing and looked down. Gia was exactly what the situation required her to be. Small. Fragile. Exquisitely disheveled in the way that suggested suffering without undermining beauty. Her dark hair fell loose around a face that was pale and tear-streaked, her clothing simple, her hands trembling just visibly enough to be noticed from across a room. She stood in the center of the entrance hall like a woman who had survived something unsurvivable, and the staff around her rearranged themselves instinctively, drawn into her orbit, offering and hovering. And Sung-woo crossed the hall to her with a speed Abigail had not seen from him before. All of his characteristic stillness dissolved. He stopped just short of her, and something moved across his face that Abigail recognized distantly as grief converting, in real time, into relief. Gia looked up at him and her expression crumpled with beautiful precision, and he said her name once, very quietly, and that was enough. Abigail watched for exactly as long as it took to understand what she was seeing. Then she turned and went back to her room. She was not wounded by it. She catalogued this fact with some detachment, the way she catalogued everything. She felt no wound because she had never placed herself in a position to be wounded. What she felt instead was the particular alertness of someone who has been in enough dangerous situations to recognize when something in the room is wrong in a way that has nothing to do with grief or reunion or love. Gia had walked into this palace less than 18 hours after a coordinated armed attack on its south gate. She filed that and said nothing. The formal introduction happened at dinner, which Abigail attended because declining would have required an explanation, and explanations cost leverage. Gia was composed by then, soft-spoken, her eyes still carrying the practiced shimmer of recent tears. She acknowledged Abigail with a gaze that was warm and empty in equal measure, the specific warmth of a woman who has already assessed a room and found nothing in it that concerns her. Abigail ate and watched and kept her face open and pleasant. It was during the post-dinner movement toward the salon, the casual shuffle of people relocating with their drinks, that she saw it. Jicha's gown was floor-length, but she moved with the particular grace of someone accustomed to longer hems, and at one point, descending the single step from the dining room, the fabric shifted and rose 2 inches above the floor. The tattoo was on her left ankle. Small, deliberate, partially obscured but not completely. A coiled shape with a specific angular crown that Abigail had seen once before, on the forearm of one of the men who had come through the south gate with guns. She picked up her glass and took a slow sip. She did not look at GR again for the rest of the evening. She did not look at Sung Woo either, who sat beside GR with his hand resting close to hers on the table, guilt and tenderness rearranging his face into something almost unrecognizable. Abigail smiled at something Hyun-soo said to her left and laughed at the appropriate moment. Inside, she was already thinking 3 moves ahead. The next 2 days were quiet in the way that certain silences are not restful but loaded. Gia moved through the palace with increasing ease, her fragility receding by degrees so gradual that if you weren't watching carefully you might have attributed it simply to healing. She relearned the staff's names. She took meals with Sung Woo in the small dining room off the west wing, the intimate one, not the formal hall. She touched his arm when she spoke to him. She was, by every observable measure, a woman carefully and genuinely reconstructing herself in the place she belonged. Abigail watched all of it from an appropriate distance and said nothing to anyone. She had not yet found a way to raise what she knew. The tattoo alone was not enough, not in this palace, not with this man, not while Sung Woo was looking at GR with 2 years of grief converting itself into something that made him temporarily blind. Bringing a single piece of circumstantial evidence to a man in that condition would not produce an investigation. It would produce a dismissal, and worse, it would tell GR precisely how much Abigail had seen. So she waited and she gathered and she said nothing. On the 3rd morning she woke to the sound of her door. Not a knock. The door opened, which meant the keycode had been used from outside, and before she had fully surfaced from sleep there were 2 of Sung Woo's security team inside her room, their expressions professionally neutral and their posture communicating something that was not neutrality at all. Hyun-soo appeared in the doorway behind them. "Ms. Abigail," he said. "Get dressed, please." She looked at the security team. She looked at Hyun-soo. She got dressed. They walked her down 2 levels to a room she had not been in before, below the formal floors, below the service corridors, into a part of the palace that the grand architecture above gave no indication of. The lighting changed down here. The ceilings lowered. The marble gave way to stone. Sung Woo was already in the room. He was standing at a table, and on the table were documents she recognized as operational. Shipment routes, schedules, coordinates, the kind of material whose exposure could dismantle months of organized movement in a single afternoon. Beside the documents was a leather folio she had never seen before. A burner phone she had also never seen. A key card with no markings. All of it, she understood immediately, had come from her room. "These were found in your suite this morning," Sung Woo said. His voice had returned to the register she remembered from the contract table. Flat. Precise. Feeling nothing in particular. Along with evidence that this information was transmitted to an external party at 2 a.m. Abigail looked at the table. Then she looked at him. "I didn't do this." The evidence was planted. She kept her voice even. "Sung Woo, I have been in this palace for over a month. I negotiated my contract, I fulfilled my obligations, and when your underboss tried to push me out with 40% of what I was owed, I walked away with double. I do not take shortcuts. I do not make amateur mistakes." She gestured at the table. "And I would never leave evidence in my own room." Something moved behind his eyes. Not belief, not yet, but the faint interference of doubt with certainty. It was not enough. "Take her downstairs," he said. The security team moved and she did not resist them, because resistance would have cost her the only thing she had left in this room, which was composure. She walked between them with her chin level and her breathing controlled, and just before they turned the corner she looked back. Sung Woo had not moved. He was still at the table, his eyes on the planted evidence, one hand resting on its surface. He was not looking at her. But across the room, half-shadowed in the doorway she had not noticed, Gia stood watching Abigail leave. And she was not crying anymore. "Subscribe real quick, tell me where you're watching from and get ready, because the next 5 seconds will shock you." They put her in a room with a drain in the floor and 2 guards outside the door, which told her they intended to interrogate her properly and had not yet decided what properly meant. She had perhaps 2 hours before that decision got made for her. She sat on the single chair and assessed what she had. No phone. No bag. They had taken both upstairs. What she had was the room itself, stone walls, a ceiling fixture with an exposed junction box, a metal chair bolted at the base but not, she noted, at the back legs. A tray from an earlier prisoner with a ceramic cup that had not been cleared. And 2 guards whose rotation she had been quietly timing since they brought her down, men doing a job they found routine, which meant they had stopped being fully careful about it. Routine was always the first vulnerability. She waited 40 minutes. Then she began to cry. Not loudly. She was precise about it, audible distress, controlled enough to seem like someone trying and failing to hold it together. The kind of crying that makes men outside doors uncomfortable in a specific way that is different from the way it makes them suspicious. She heard the shift outside. The low exchange. Then the door opened 2 inches and one of them looked in. She was already moving when it opened 3. She came off the chair fast, drove the heel of her palm into the hinge edge of the door with her full weight behind it, felt the impact travel up her arm and connect with whatever was on the other side, and was through the gap before he had finished falling. The second guard was turning and she was already inside his reach, which was the only place his size stopped being an advantage. She had grown up in neighborhoods that taught you that if a fight was unavoidable you ended it in the first 10 seconds or you did not end it at all. She ended it in 8. She took the first guard's jacket, his radio, and his access card. She left them both breathing. Then she walked up through the lower corridors with the jacket over her arm and her pace measured, because running in a palace full of security cameras was how you became the most interesting thing on every monitor simultaneously. She found the service exit off the kitchen corridor and was outside in 11 minutes. The city received her the way cities always received women moving fast and alone at difficult hours, with complete indifference. She kept to secondary streets, put 6 blocks between herself and the palace, and then stopped in the doorway of a closed pharmacy to think. She had known about Sung Woo's rival syndicate, Heechee Group, before she ever signed the contract. She had done her research the way she did everything, thoroughly and privately, which meant she also knew that their European operations ran through a logistics consultancy on the 4th floor of a glass office building 20 minutes east of the palace. A legitimate-looking front that processed real invoices and employed real administrative staff, behind which the actual accounting happened on an air-gapped internal server that was, according to the information she had sourced 3 weeks ago as basic self-preservation research, accessible only from 2 terminals on the building's interior network. She had hoped she would never need that information. She needed it now. Getting into the building took 40 minutes and required a stolen lanyard, a convincing story about a forgotten laptop delivered to the security desk in a tone of exhausted professional urgency, and the specific social skill of making yourself appear too ordinary to be a threat. Getting to the 4th floor required the access card from the guard's jacket. Getting into the server room required a paperclip and 8 minutes and a competency she had acquired at 17 in circumstances she had never discussed with anyone. The encrypted files took 4 minutes to locate and transfer onto the drive she pulled from inside the lining of her shoe, where it had been since the morning she first packed her bag. She had always believed in contingency planning. She walked back out into the city night with the evidence against GR in her pocket and the palace burning in the distance like an answer to a question she had not finished asking yet. Don't blink. Subscribe, comment your country, then watch what happens next. You're not ready. She had one night to decide what to do with what she had. The logical move was clean and obvious. Take the files to someone outside the syndicate, someone with enough institutional leverage to make the information matter, and disappear while the consequences worked themselves out. She had the money. She had the drive. She had a head start. Every calculation she had run since she was old enough to run calculations pointed in the same direction. She bought a dress instead. It was not sentiment. She was precise about this with herself, sitting in the back of a cab with a garment bag across her lap and the drive warm in her palm. It was not sentiment and it was not attraction and it was not the look on Sung Woo's face in the red-lit safe room when he had watched her like she was the most real thing he had ever seen. It was the tattoo on GH's ankle and the drain in the floor of the interrogation room and the specific quality of injustice that Abigail had never, in her entire life, been able to walk away from cleanly. She told herself that. She was mostly convincing. The gala was at 9. By 8:40 she was at the palace's East Garden entrance, which the catering staff were using and which, in the organized chaos of a high society event, received her borrowed uniform and borrowed tray without question. Inside, the palace had transformed. Every chandelier blazed. The marble floors reflected 1,000 moving points of candlelight. Women in architectural gowns moved between men in dark suits, and the cumulative weight of money and danger in the room was a physical thing, like humidity. She dropped the tray at the first opportunity and put on the dress in a service bathroom in 4 minutes flat. She found the drive in her hand and Hyunsu in the main hall simultaneously. He saw her and went very still, the stillness of a man making a rapid series of decisions, and she crossed to him before he could make the wrong one. "The files prove GR is Heech's operative," she said quietly. "She leaked the shipment routes. She ran the Southgate attack. She is here tonight to finish what the attack started." She pressed the drive into his hand. "You have about 20 minutes before whatever she's planned goes live." Hyunsu looked at the drive. Then he looked at her. Then he moved. What happened next happened fast. She heard the commotion from the east corridor first, the specific sound of a situation abandoning its pretense of control, and then the room shifted in the way rooms shift when trained men suddenly move with purpose. Guests registered that something was wrong 3 seconds after it already was. The lights dropped to emergency levels and someone screamed, and the architecture of the evening collapsed entirely. She was looking for Sung-woo when the shot came. She saw GR first, no longer soft, no longer fragile, a weapon in her hand and her face finally showing the thing that had always been underneath the performance, and she saw the angle of it, the clean unobstructed line between the gun and Sung-woo's back, and Sung-woo turning too slowly because he had not yet understood that the woman he had grieved for 2 years had come here tonight specifically to ensure he could not grieve anything ever again. Abigail moved without calculating it. She crossed the distance and put herself into that line, and the impact was enormous and simple and strangely quiet, a force that knocked the breath from her completely and dropped her sideways, and then the marble was cold against her cheek and the sounds of the room became distant and rearranged. She was aware of Sung-woo above her. His voice saying her name with a quality it had never carried before, not the flat precision of the contract table, not the low register of the safe room, but something broken open and entirely uncontrolled. She tried to tell him she was fine. She was not entirely fine. But she had the presence of mind, in the narrowing brightness, to think, the debt is clear. Every last cent of it. She came back to consciousness in increments. Warmth first. Then the particular softness of a surface that cost more than anything she had ever owned. Then light, filtered and amber, coming from somewhere to her left at an angle that suggested late afternoon. She lay still for a long moment before she opened her eyes, an old habit from years of waking in situations where understanding the room before announcing yourself was the smarter approach. The master bedroom was vast and quiet. Not the quiet of emptiness but of a space being deliberately held that way. Fresh flowers on the far console. Someone had thought of that. The kind of medical equipment that did not come from hospitals but from the particular resources of men who handled their crises privately. And beside the bed, in a chair drawn close enough that it had clearly not been moved in some time, Sung-woo. He was not asleep. He was watching her with an expression she had no existing category for. She had catalogued many of his expressions over the weeks in this palace. The assessing look. The cold authority. The fractured grief of the portrait gallery. The raw, unguarded quality of the safe room. This was none of those things. This was something that had moved past all of them into territory she suspected he had not occupied in a very long time, if ever. "You're awake," he said. "Apparently," she said. Her voice came out smaller than she intended. She recalibrated. He leaned forward and she noticed then that he was not sitting upright in the chair. He was leaning with his elbows on his knees, his hands loosely clasped, his whole posture carrying none of its habitual dominance. He looked like a man who had been taken apart and had not yet decided how to reassemble himself. "Heechee is finished," he said. "GR is," he stopped. Began again. "She will not be returning." Abigail nodded once. She did not ask for details. She had never needed details. "The drive," she said, "was enough. More than enough." He was quiet for a moment. "Hyunsu told me what you said to him. What you gave him." His eyes did not leave her face. "You had everything you needed to disappear. The money. The evidence. A head start." A pause. "Why did you come back?" She considered giving him the clean answer, the practical one, the answer that kept everything at the transactional distance she had maintained since the morning she first walked into this palace with her hands loose in her lap and her face arranged into something unreadable. She found she was too tired for it. "I don't know," she said. Which was the most honest thing she had said to anyone in years. Something shifted in his face. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and set an object on the bed beside her hand. She looked down. It was a key, ornate, old, the kind that belonged to something architectural and permanent. The kind that was not metaphorical but carried the weight of one anyway. "This palace," he said, "operates under a single authority. It always has." He looked at the key, then at her. "I spent 2 years preserving a memory. I built everything around the shape of an absence." He paused. "And then you walked into my entrance hall and negotiated a contract with the composure of a woman who had already decided she was worth more than I was offering." Despite everything, something pulled at the corner of her mouth. "You were in the corridor," she said, "when I walked out on Hyunsu." "I was in the corridor," he confirmed. He reached out then and rested his hand over hers, not gripping, not performing, simply placing it there with the quiet deliberateness of a man making a decision he intended to keep. "I don't want a substitute," he said. "I want you. Everything that came with you. The calculations. The packed bag. The paperclip." His voice dropped. "All of it." Abigail looked at the key beside her hand. Then she looked at him, really looked, the way she had not allowed herself to before. She did not pick it up. "Not yet. Ask me again," she said quietly, "when I can stand on my own 2 feet. His hand stayed where it was. And for the first time since she had known him, Sung-woo smiled, slow, certain, and entirely willing to wait. If you found this story enjoyable, please consider liking the video, sharing it, and subscribing to the channel. Be sure to turn on notifications for future stories, and feel free to explore the page to watch more of our existing content. Thank you for watching.